Hi, folks. I'm so glad you're all here today. Today we have a person who might look like the people he's written about down there in what Tim O'Brien calls the Neon Canyon. We're going to hear a couple of times about that this year. But anyway, this is Tim Ghianni, and he was a reporter, and he, as a result, spent a whole lot of time downtown. And today he's going to tell you, and you're going to have to imagine it, okay? So here's Tim.
Thank you. Again, it's Tim Ghianni. Almost everybody mispronounces my name, so I don't take offense at all. But I do. It's Tim Ghianni. In Italian, this is a rule in Italian. If you have a consonant, you have an H after the consonant, it becomes a hard consonant. So if you ever like a bottle of Chianti is CH, like spaghetti is SPAGH, and then Ghianni is GHIANNI. So anyway, I'm just giving you a quick lesson in Italian. I hope am I not speaking loudly enough?
No, speaking to the other one.
Okay. Did anybody hear what I said so far? Okay. All right. Good. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here today. I have been, as Gene mentioned, I've been here in Nashville for a long time. I was a newspaper reporter. I've been in this area since 1972, working in the media. Started out as a newspaper reporter. I was in Clarksville area for many years, and then I was at the Nashville Banner for its last 10 years of existence, and then that was the better newspaper. I'm sorry. And I did work for the Tennessean for 10 years. When the Banner folded, it broke my heart, but they did hire me, the Tennessean, and so I was there for 10 years as well, and it was good because I needed the work. They were good to me for a while. I worked there for 10 years also until I got a voluntary buyout, which they started doing when they're streamlining the newspaper industry, which, as you know, is pretty much gone now. Anyway, I worked for the Tennessee, and I'll give you real quickly, we were in the process of adopting our second child from Romania, and I needed an uninterrupted stream of income and benefits at the point that Banner folded. And the Tennessean offered me that uninterrupted stream. Otherwise, I would have had to go back to the bottom of the list in the adoptions. So anyway, I was glad the Tennessean hired me, and of course I'm very glad that I have two children from Romania. So in fact, my son Joe, who was that child, he's in Minneapolis, and he works for the Adoption Medical Center, which is the only center in the United States that works with mostly international adoptions and the families. And so he went into the field that he loves. Anyway, that's enough about me. I was in the newspapers, though. I always wanted to be a newspaper man. After the newspaper bought me out in 2007, I started working as you guys know, there probably aren't a lot of jobs out there for 56-year-old guys, and I found that to be the case. So I tried for a long time, but I started to be a freelance writer, and I did that, and I still do that. I don't do too much of that now, but freelance writer to pay the bills. I taught one day a week at Lipscomb for about 10 of those years, but mostly I was a freelance writer. And then all my freelance, I'm actually stealing from my speech here, but my speech is very informal. I don't really speak. It's kind of a talk. I became during the COVID pandemic, when that first hit, almost everybody cut out the freelance writers, and I was cut out. I lost all my income. Instead of being all upset about it, though, I decided I would just spend the time. Nothing I could do about it. Had no work, but I would spend my time writing this book that I'd long wanted to write. So first thing I'm going to do is I've got some cards and I don't think I have enough for everybody. These actually are the cover of the book. I don't know if you want to hand them out, Gene, and then if you don't want them, just send them back. I only had about 100 left, and I think you got them here. So just go ahead and get, that's just the cover of the book, and it has a little bit of information on the back about the book. And if you don't want one, that's fine. It won't offend me, but I just thought I'd bring them. They're publicity cards, obviously done by the publishing company. And it shows you the cover of the book and a little bit on the back about me. And see, she's handing them out. And everybody get one that wants one? Okay, well, while she's handing those out, by the way, I have a very dry mouth. I guess that comes from having been in the newspaper business, where in those days when you started out, you were smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee all hours of the day and night, and kind of dried you out. But anyway, so I don't do either of those things now. But well, I drink coffee, but I haven't smoked in 30 years. One of the great things about the newspaper business when I was there, you've seen the old newspaper movies, and the newsrooms are all filled with folks. You know, they're smoking their cigarettes, they're talking on the phone, they got 2 or 3 cigarettes burning in an ashtray. That was how it really was. So I hadn't smoked much until I went into the newspaper business. Then I was inhaling all their smoke, so I figured I'd take it up. So for about 20 years, I had that nasty habit, and I quit. My daughter told me she wanted me to quit those fire sticks. Now, she was about 3 years old, so that was enough. That was enough. I just quit. So, I mean, when you have a 3-year-old Romanian child telling you to quit, you should quit. Anyway, this book is called Pilgrims, Pickers, and Honky-Tonk Heroes, and as you've got, the ones of you have the card, and that's basically the title comes from the content in the book. And I started out writing this book about, I've got my notes here, I'll probably jump around, obviously I'll jump around. I started writing this book about Chris Christopherson and ended up writing about Bobby Bear, Johnny Cash, Little Jimmy Dickens, Funky Donnie Fritz, Mac Wiseman, Earl Scruggs, Charlie Daniels, Billy Joe Shaver, Tom T. and Dixie Hall had a lot to do with it, and there's a whole bunch more. Also in this book is my view of the city of Nashville and what we've lost more than what we've gained. But you have to just read the stories and read what the people have to say. In my opinion, it's pretty strong in there, but these are people talking to me. Although I do, in my own way, lament what has happened since I first moved here in 1972. Anyway, the paraphrase what I just said about Johnny Cash, started writing about Chris Christopherson, Funky Donnie Fritz, all those people. That's actually a paraphrase of the introduction to Chris Christopherson's Pilgrim Chapter 33 song, and it's a way of beginning my explanation of why I spent more than a year reliving my time with some of Nashville's great musical heroes, and some of them were no heroes. They were heroes to me. They weren't all stars, and why I wanted to write about them committing their first-person memories to paper, to book form, and it was a gesture of love for me. These people, I'll go ahead and stray from my notes right away. I started out writing about these people. I was lucky in that in my newspaper career, I wrote about just about everything from, by the way, I apologize for no visual aids. I'm not a technology person. I talk and I write, and that's about it. But during my newspaper career, which was, I was in newsrooms for 34 years. My mother was a newspaper woman in World War II, which is what inspired me to choose that profession. I loved my mother. She was very proud of her. Anyway, she instilled in me the love of the word. But in my newspaper profession, started out in sports as a sports editor, high school sports writer, then I was sports editor, and then I came down to Nashville. Well, actually up in Clarksville, then I became associate editor for a number of years, which made me the editor who was actually in charge of the daily. It was a morning newspaper, so the real editor came in the daytime and went to the meetings and dealt with the advertisers and all that junk that I didn't want to deal with, didn't have to deal with. And at night, I was in charge of working with the reporters and the photographers and putting the paper out. And I loved that job, but I topped out up there, and so I started looking for work here, and there was no doubt that what I wanted to do was come to Nashville. I mean, I love Clarksville, still have friends up there, but I was up there for 14 years. But I wanted to come to Nashville. My mom and dad moved here in 1972. I grew up in the Chicago area, and where my father had half of a company, he ran half of a company. It was called Comfort Zone Swim Pool Heaters, and the other half of the company was called Lock and Bar. They did the in-home heaters, water heaters. They were in Detroit. They combined to buy it. They decided they better be together, so they bought a factory on Sidco Drive here in a former water heater factory, and then they became one company here. I did not know at the time, like in the time I was in college in my junior year, I didn't know until like January of that year that they were moving. That just kind of was a thing, and so I came down here my first visit to Nashville was when I graduated from college. I wanted to be near my parents, and I wanted to see what Nashville was all about. Of course, I left all my friends up in the Chicago area and left the Cubs, which I loved. But I came down here. In fact, even Nashville wasn't even, the interstate wasn't even completed at that point. I had to come down. My first roll into Nashville was on Dickerson Pike, and then I was able to jump up onto 65. There was a short stretch that ended out by 100 Oaks, and I dropped down onto Franklin Pike. My parents lived, they're deceased now, but they lived out in Forest Hills off Kingsbury, in that part of town, off Old Hickory Boulevard. So they lived there since 1972, and my father lived there. My mom, she passed away in 1999, but my dad, he was here until 4 years ago, and he lived by himself in a house that he loved in Forest Hills. Anyways, I wanted to be around my parents to start my career, and also my mother. This is more than you need to know, but my mother had a genetic lung disease, and so her health wasn't good, and so I also wanted to be so I was within shouting distance of my mother and father if they needed me. And I liked Nashville. I liked what I saw. When I came to Nashville, came in on 31E, rolled downtown, and everything you could see. Most of you are probably from here, but you could see the Capitol building. You could see it was the insurance, L&C Tower. You could see the Stallman building. I believe that had the WKDA neon on it. It was before it became predominantly WKDF. And then you could see, like I said, the Capitol building. And that was really all you saw if you came into town. Everything else was really low slung, and mostly 2 stories all the way downtown. And actually, I really liked it that way a lot. It was that atmosphere that I fell in love with Nashville. It was just that I knew that I'd liked this. Then there are things that have gone since then. Of course, this is a love letter. My book is a love letter to all the people that I talked about in the first couple of sentences, but it's also a love letter to Nashville, or at least that Nashville from 50 years ago, rather. See, things that were here when I first moved here, and you would remember, were Harvey's still had the Monkey Bar and the Carousel. When going to shop, that included trips to Kane, Sloan, and Kastner's on Church Street. Woolworths and the arcade were flourishing, and you could get your dog washed and flea dipped on Saturday at the Acme Feed Company. And when the cobblestone streets were being replaced by asphalt, that was happening right then, and more on that in just a second. I've already spoken about where I worked. My wife and I, however, live in Nashville of the past. We live in Creve Hall neighborhood. We've been there for more than 30 years. We love it there. We're worried right now that this new Nashville, with the proposal to change single dwelling lots to multiplexes so they can have quadruplexes, that's a stupid idea. We're worried that that'll get into not just our neighborhood, but every other neighborhood that right now is a nice, older, settled, pretty, tree-lined, Nashville, slow-paced Nashville neighborhood. And I think we're going to be okay, but that does bother me. And that's what the change in the city to the high rises is one of the things that I lament, and the way the city is, that's different. The way that it's different is part of what I talk about in the book. Now, we have, of course, the cities. I'm going to get to the characters here in a minute because they tell the story. But we have what's changed most dramatically. Excuse me. There's that newspaper life coming back to me. But we have downtown on Lower Broadway now. What I always tell people is a neon Disney World. It's not Nashville like when I first came. I hate to go down there. Now I have to on occasion, but I really hate to go down there. It's not the Nashville I first came to. When I first came to Nashville, the Lower Broadway, the neon Disney World of today, which will keep growing and will keep going up the side streets. It's not going to just end on Lower Broad. It's going to go up second and go down first. It's going to go up. It's already going on all those side streets now. But that was the Nashville I fell in love with, and I wish still existed. But my mom would always tell me, if wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. The Nashville that I liked was, I fell in love with Lower Broadway. I liked the city. I was 20 years old. I was working at a water heater factory. I worked for my dad that first summer, so I was working at a water heater factory by day, and at night I was a 20-year-old young man exploring the city, and most of those explorations involved beer and music on Lower Broadway. And there was a place particularly, it was called The Wheel. I don't think it's one that's there now unless it's a different, it's moved to a different place. But it was right next to a peep show that was on the corner of 5th and Lower Broadway. Where that peep show was now is Rippy's, and where that bar was is Rippy's. The typical, nothing wrong with Rippy's, I've been there. I don't want to complain about these places. The business people need to do business, but it's a typical Lower Nashville bar, and that it's multi-level, offers overpriced food, sometimes pretty good music, not always, but sometimes all the pickers need to have a place to play. Sometimes pretty good music, and then of course a lot of beer. Well, but that kind of bar is all up and down that street now. There were maybe 6 at the most back when I first started going down there. There was Tootsie's and Roberts, and I really can't remember the names of the others. They were pretty indiscriminate. I think that's the right word. They were, anyway, they were, I used the wrong word, indistinguishable. Indiscriminate would be good too, but they were indistinguishable. But they were not that was the era. Tootsie's was 2 stories. Now it's 4. I used to go in, and when I'd go into Tootsie's, I would go see, and Hattie Bess was still the owner of Tootsie, and she was there, and she had her knitting needles that she would poke the pickers if they got out of line. And the fellas did get out of line a lot, because that's where they would go to drink, particularly after they were doing their recording sessions. Tootsie's was a great place to go, calm down, chat with friends after a while. So that was the Nashville I loved. There was also down the street there, there was, what's the name of the restaurant? Line Baw's. Line Baw's restaurant. You may or may not remember Line Baw's. It's been replaced, years ago it was replaced by Merchants. And now it looks like, and Merchants was the name at that time, when Line Baw's was on the corner of 4th and Broad. Merchants was a hotel right next to it, just a residential hotel for people who come to town on Greyhounds and whatever. And now that was, Merchants then became, of course, long ago it became the restaurant Merchants, and now it looks like, from what I've been reading, people are going to get rid of that and probably put another cowboy honky-tonk up. Again, these guys, some of them I know very well. The names, they're not the owners really of these bars. Some of them I know very well and I like them, but I just don't like the change in the street. It's the city is I'll let my opinion slide in here. The city too often is catering to the 100 new people who come a day, and not enough to those of us who decided long ago to sink our roots here because of what Nashville was. And I'm sorry to see that happen. That's the same thing with the quadruplex dilemma. So, let me sit here. I hope I'm not rambling too much here. I have a speech, but I haven't really used it. I fell in love. I'll tell you about Bobby Bear. You guys probably know what Bobby Bear is. He'll be 89 in first part of April, 7th or 9th. I can't remember, but he's still. In fact, he just called while I was getting ready to sit down here. I'll call him back this afternoon. He and I talk frequently, and he'll come back around here in this story. But probably the biggest thing, one single event that caused me to fall in love with Nashville was an evening when it was due to Bobby Bear. I didn't know who this guy was. One night I was down, and I was 20 years old. I was just getting ready to be a senior in college out at Iowa State. But I was down there on Lower Broadway at the bar I usually went to, and it had been announced in the paper that the city, Mayor Fulton and the Metro Council were going to start paving over all the bricks and cobblestones that were down there, all those streets. I know that Church has got some bricks on it, but that was later. That was with Fulton putting those in. But this was Mayor Beverly Briley. They were going to put asphalt. That's all those streets, not just Lower Broad, but 4th, 5th, 6th, 1st, all that streets, all the streets down there. And I kind of liked the cobblestones. I liked that they were bricks. I liked the brick streets. I thought they were pretty attractive. They were bumpy. And of course, it's not very easy to fill potholes in bricks. Of course, apparently it's not very easy to look at Nashville to fill potholes in asphalt. My wife's only had 2 flat tires since the winter, so I'm sure some of you have as well. Anyway, I decided that I didn't think that they should get rid of the bricks. So I was down there. I went down there. I figured these bricks were walked on by Andrew Jackson, maybe, but at least by Hank Williams and all the greats, Tammy Wynette, all the greats of country music, going way back to the Scruggs and people like that, and going back all the way back to when the Grand Ole Opry was down there at the Ryman all the time, which was part of my attraction for being down there. I decided that those bricks shouldn't all disappear. So I was down there. I pulled up on 5th Avenue South, parked next to that peep show that was there. There were peep shows and prostitutes a lot down there. It was not safe, I guess, but apparently it was more safe than it is now down there. I'll have to sadly say that. But you don't agree with that?
I live right down it. I have never been through it, but it's all.
Okay, that's okay. That's fine. I'm glad I don't live down there, so I'm glad it's safe. There's just been too many news stories lately that it's scary, but I'm sure it's not. But it was very safe back then as well, and as far as I could tell. And again, apparently it's still very safe. That's not really the point. But I decided I pulled up, and I had an old 65 Falcon with a relatively small trunk. I was going to save some of those bricks. The paving was going to be the next day. And so I opened my trunk, I had a screwdriver, and I got it out, and I was popping some of the bricks, and others were already loose. So I was starting to put bricks in my trunk. And nobody was stopping me. No police or anybody came by that I know of. But I hear in the distance, I hear this laughter. And I look back, if you're standing at the 5th and you're looking south, I guess you'd be looking south, Lower Broadway, looking toward where the Country Music Hall of Fame is now. Back there where the Hall of Fame is now, there's just gravel parking lots and some old buildings, but mostly it was gravel parking lots there, where the Hilton is downtown. where the convention center is, where the arena is. At that point, Nashville was still just starting to build, and so they're empty parking lots that were kind of dark, and scary, but they were free, which you can't find free parking here now. You know, it saved you a lot of money to park there and walk, as long as you didn't get frightened. I have to admit that I was frightened some late nights. That's only fair. But so I see there's these two fellas, and they're walking out of the darkness there, coming from those gravel parking lots. And they're just laughing and having a great time. And so they came up to me, and they say, "Hey, son, what are you doing?" This isn't verbatim. It's in the book as verbatim. Say, "Hey, son, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm rescuing some bricks." And they said, "Why?" And I explained to them why. And so they said, "Well, that seems like a really good idea. Let us help you." And I said, "Fine, that's fine. You know, I can use the help. This is fairly hard work at 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever." And so we were there, and these guys started helping me. They stayed with me for a better part of an hour. And it turned out to be, it was Shel Silverstein and Bobby Bare. And this was back in 1972. They'd just come from recording sessions. I think this was their Lullabies, Legends, and Lies sessions, but actually Shel and Bobby teamed up on a lot of different work over the years. In fact, there's a box set of Bobby Bare singing Shel Silverstein. Shel's best known, if you don't know Shel, he did, of course, a lot of children's books also. But his song that he's best known for wasn't a Bear song. It was A Boy Named Sue, which is probably, that's what Shel wrote that. That's the kind of humor that applies in all of his songs. Anyway, and he was Bear's best friend. They were just inseparable. So they decided, they were headed, they told me, I finally figured out who they were. And I was proud to have these guys helping me, but they told me that they just finished a session. They were going to go over to Tootsie's and meet some fellas, but they had plenty of time to help me. So they did. Just we chatted, and I only had the one screwdriver, so sometimes I'd have to hand one of them the screwdriver. But we also a lot of the bricks were really loose. We got the trunk loaded up, several hundred pounds of bricks, and it was kind of hard on my suspension. But we got a trunk. And then they said, "Well, we're going to go now." There's something like, Shel says, "Let's go. We need to go on back over to Tootsie's." I think they were meeting, I don't think they were meeting Willie. I think it was maybe Willie, but Billy Joe Shaver. Some of those guys were over there. That's where they all went at night. And they said, "We're meeting our friends over at Tootsie's. We're going to leave now." And I said, "Thanks for your help, guys." And they told me, "Thank you for what you're doing." And I don't know, it seemed to make sense at 1 o'clock. By then it's almost 2 o'clock in the morning, that these two actually became legends, had helped me in a great brick heist on Lower Broadway and Fifth Avenue South. And the bricks, I'm sorry to say, I no longer have them. I've tried to track them back down, but you can't. It's hard to drive into your mom's and dad's house at 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning, and say, "Well, I'm going to unload a half ton of bricks." And so I just, I ended up with another person who was keeping them for me, and they're gone now. So I've been trying. I may find one of them. I'm still working on that. That was Bobby Bare and his influence on me, and I'm going to get back to Bare here in a few minutes. But there's some other people that influenced me and are in this book. This book, by the way, kind of originated from when I was at the Nashville Banner. I had been a news editor. I was state editor in charge of government coverage. I had a bureau of reporters in Washington covering the president and all. I mean, I enjoyed it. It was really, and we also covered news outside of Nashville, breaking news. They had a city desk that covered like breaking news in the city. And so I liked that. I did that for many years. But then they decided they wanted somebody to put a harder edge on country music coverage. This would have been the time that Garth Brooks first became big, and he was making Taylor Swift kind of headlines back then. And so they wanted more news on that sort of thing, about not just about Garth, but about box office and the rise in the hat acts at the time and all that. And there were several folks, including Vince Gill, who didn't wear a hat were called the Hat Acts at that time. And so they wanted somebody who could put some news sense into that coverage rather than just features. So anyway, I went over there, and the problem was that I would go in at 4:30 in the morning. See, I should be referring to my notes here. I hope I'm not hemming and hawing too much here. But I would go in at 4:30 in the morning. My music writers, who I had two really good music writers, they didn't come in until 10 because they worked the night before generally. They had to go to concerts, they had to go to clubs, they had to go to #1 parties on Music Row. They had to do all that kind of stuff. So they worked nights, so they wouldn't come in until 10. But if somebody died overnight, and back then they used to put obituaries for free on everybody in the newspaper. Everybody who died, if you filled out an obit form, the funeral home would drop it off or call it in, or we'd call them, and everybody got a free obituary in the newspaper. Now they cost thousands and thousands of dollars in the newspaper, which is a shame. Now I advise people, even an old newspaper man, I advise people to just go to have the funeral home post a nice one online that you can write yourself. Anyway, they were calling, so these obits were coming in, and we had one fellow who was in charge of obits. His name was Tom Norman. Tom would go through the obits, and if it was anybody in the music business, he would bring them over to me, and I'd have to try to come up with the obituary. As a guy who'd spent his life in news and in sports before that, but mostly in hard news, I didn't know where to start. The only thing I thought of, well, I'd seen I knew Chet Atkins knew everybody. And I'd seen him perform. I'd been to one of these celebrity golf tournaments where he played, and all that sort of thing. And I was a big fan of his music, but I'd never met him. But I looked in the phone book, and back then people had their numbers in the phone book. And so I just called Chet Atkins. And I'm talking about calling him at 5 o'clock in the morning. And it was like a Danny Davis or one of those fellas, one of those players had died. It may have been Floyd Kramer, but it was one of those guys. So I called Chet Atkins. He answers the phone. I said, "Mr. Atkins, this is Tim Ghianni. I'm the entertainment editor of the Tennessean, or at the Banner rather at that point. And I need some help. I need to we'll just say it was Danny Davis. Danny Davis has died, and I need to get some quotes from you because I know you know everybody, and then some names and numbers of other folks who you think I ought to call." And he was really glad about that. He gave me, we talked, and he gave me several folks I should call, which I did, and I wrote down this list of people and phone numbers. And then this happened many times that I would call Chet. He was always my first call on an obituary. In fact, not long before he died, he joked me that he said that one of these days you're going to call about me and I won't be here to answer you. I was sorry when that day actually came, but he was a great man. So Chet was one of my influences in getting to know people in Nashville and building this list. It was a list of people, and the result of that list of people is in this book. A list of people who I would call on a regular basis. First, I just called them for obituaries. But then I would call them for maybe stories, because these were mostly the older artists, and they weren't getting coverage anymore. It was all Garth, and then it was Kenny Chesney, and then it was, whatever the next big thing was back then. Tim McGraw it was that era, and so these guys weren't getting any coverage. But I decided I would call, and we'd have to. So in addition to helping with obits, I would end up just calling them and just chatting with them, and eventually maybe do a story, or they would sometimes just tell me they were glad to talk to somebody and to call back if I could. So I got this long list, and it was 40 names, phone numbers. 38 of those people are in here. And people that I would call and just chat with. This lasted until my Tennessean years also, because I was the entertainment editor there as well. Just when there was a break, I had 10 minutes between editions, or I was waiting for one of my music writers to turn in a story, I would just call one of these gentlemen, or there were some women, but mostly gentlemen. I would call and we'd just chat. And it was really to let them know more than anything that I cared about them, but that also that they still mattered, that not everybody, even in this era when their music wasn't selling a lot and they weren't filling the concert halls anymore, they still mattered a lot. They were important to Nashville and to the city's growth. And we became friends, and they would invite me then. I would call them regularly. For years and years, I made these calls. Then they started dying off, so I scratched off their numbers, of course. And but I had this list that I carried with me. And like I said, it was between editions or whatever. I'd do 5 minutes. I'd talk to Mac Wiseman, or I'd call Earl Scruggs' house and mostly I'd talk to Louise, who was his wife, and the brains behind the outfit, the woman who really set the standard for managing country music artists. And she was a lot of people thought she was too strict. I loved Louise. She did me a favor one day when Johnny Cash died, and I said, well, who should I call? Peter Cooper was the main music writer at that point. He's deceased now. But he had spent 3 weeks writing a pre-Cash obituary, getting it ready for publication. But then the day that John died, by then I knew John also, but the day that John died, we had to call, Peter would finish up his obituary, but then the rest of us, the other 2 of us, would start calling other people to get reactions, because I had my list. And one person that I really wanted to talk, I talked to people on that list. I called Bobby Bear. His wife, Jeannie, answered the phone. Bobby was out fishing, but she said she'd get the message to him when he stopped at a catfish house all the time up on the way back. So she'd get the message up there, and he called me back. It's a catfish house or a bait shop or whatever it was. Anyway, so, and I called a lot of people. But I really wanted to talk to Bob Dylan, who had been, of course, he was a baby boom hero, but he also brought a love of country music. He made it more pop, but he brought the country music, not pop, more harder edge folk, but the love of country music to the rest of the world. And he did 4 albums down here that were those were actually, I think, well, I have one other favorite, but those 4 albums were among my favorites of his. But I really wanted to talk to Dylan, who was he was a Cash acolyte. Every time he was down here, he'd see Johnny Cash. He was on the Johnny Cash show, all that sort of thing. And so I wanted to talk to Dylan, and Louise said, I can get him for you. She said, if there's anybody in the world who can get Bob Dylan for you, get Bobby for you, it's me. And I said, okay, I'll be here all night. Well, eventually she kept calling me back all day long. And I mean, I had gotten Earl's comments, by the way, but she would call me back all day long. And finally, she called me probably late at night and said she never did get through to Bob Dylan, but I never, just the fact that basically this very busy businesswoman would spend a good chunk of her workday trying to track down Bob Dylan for me for a few quotes for a news story, that meant a lot. So I'm going to see what I left out here. There was another thing that led to another incident, and this is all in this book, and you say, as I say, it shows the changing in Nashville also through these guys' eyes. Christopherson, I already mentioned Christopherson at the beginning, but I always, when I was still up north, am I taking too much time, by the way? Okay. When I was still up north, I was still in Chicago. I read about this Christopherson guy, and so I started buying his albums. I really liked him. I was still then more of a lyrics guy I'm not a musical ace. I wish I was, but I love well-crafted lyrics, and so I was a fan of the Beatles and Dylan and the Rolling Stones and the people that you'd expect a guy like me to be enamored with, and that hasn't changed. But I bought, and I had a Johnny Cash record also. We always watched the Johnny Cash show, and I got that summer. I bought Live at San Quentin. Anyway, I read about Chris, and so I went to the record store, which existed back then, and you'd go hang out at the record store, and I bought the Silver-Tongued Devil and I album. And from that point on, I was just a fanatic about Chris Christopherson. So when I moved to Nat, and I played him at school, I bought all of his records while I was still up in Chicago. Played them at school, made people on my dorm floor listen to them. And some of them really liked it, and some didn't, but that was okay. Chris's voice is not great, but it's Chris's voice. And his words are wonderful. Anyway, so one of my goals coming down here was to meet Chris Christopherson. because I thought, well, if I'm going to meet anybody, I'm going to meet Chris. And it just shows up in the book as well. But one day, his publicist called me, and Chris was putting out a movie, A Soldier's Daughter Never Cries. We're talking about 20-some years ago now. And also, he had a new album, live in San Francisco, or someplace type album out, a double album. So they wanted some publicity, which is, of course, what newspapers rely on, is getting publicists to call you and get you an artist. And the publicist asked who would I recommend it to, and I said, me. And so I took the Chris interview, and we talked. It was supposed to be like a 20-minute, usually you get a 15 to 20-minute break for an interview in the newsroom, but we had more than an hour. He was just letting other calls go, which I'm sure I'm sure irritated other journalists, but we just had a great time. So after he and his wife Lisa, they got back to where they live in Hawaii, and they eventually got a copy of that newspaper, excuse me. And they called and said they'd love to meet me the next day. They thanked me for such a great story. That's just, I'm bragging on myself there. I'm not sure it was great. They said it was. Anyway, they thanked me. They said the next time they were in Nashville, they'd give me a call and we could get together. Okay, well, this was one of my heroes, and I was going to be able to get together with Chris Christopherson and maybe get him to walk down Music Row with me, because that's what I wanted to talk about with him, was the changes in Music Row. And we're talking now 2003. In the spring, first time he came back was for June Carter Cash's funeral, and he and his family just flew in from Hawaii, didn't stay. I mean, I'm sure they stayed a night, but they flew right back. And so I did talk to them briefly, but he said, well, I wasn't trying to interview him then. I just wanted to say hello to him, introduce myself face to face. But he said next time, when he had time, he still wanted to get with me. The next time was later in 2003 when Johnny Cash died, and Chris was the eulogist at that one, and did some singing, and it was a beautiful service. Some of you may have been there, I don't know, a lot of people were. But in any case, Chris was staying in Nashville for a couple of weeks after the funeral, which I covered, but I covered both funerals. And he was staying in Nashville after the funeral, and he was going to be around, like I said, for 2 weeks, because they were doing the Cash tribute special. They were getting it ready to tape at the Ryman, or they may have done that. I didn't go to the taping, I couldn't, but it may have been at the arena. The arena was there. Anyway, I'm not sure where it was. They were going to do this taping. So he had a lot of free time, downtime in Nashville to meet up with friends. And his wife called and said, what are you doing Sunday afternoon, Tim? And I said, well, I was going to watch the football game, but that was about it. And she said, well, how would you like to go ahead? I'd already told her I want to take Chris back to Music Row. She said, what would you think about picking Chris up and taking him down there a Sunday afternoon? You can make it a Sunday afternoon coming down. She's referring to one of Chris's songs, which is Sunday Morning Coming Down, perhaps his best song. But I said, well, that would be wonderful. So I went out, they were staying at Lowe's Vanderbilt, and I went and I picked him up, and he had his son, Johnny, named for Johnny Cash, was 16, and Johnny was going to be doing a video. He had decided, he'd asked his dad if he could come. He didn't know much about his dad's Nashville time. The family, they lived in Hawaii, and occasionally visited Malibu, but they're still in Hawaii. In fact, I think they sold their Malibu residence, but regardless. So Johnny came along, because he wanted to learn about his dad's Nashville stuff, and he wanted to take a video for a project for school, do a video. They were supposed to do a video project of something, and he figured his dad was a good subject. So Johnny came along, which was fine. I said, that's fine. Nice kid. He's a nice grown-up guy. But anyway, he was a very nice kid. He came along and did that. He didn't get in the way or anything. And so Chris and I walked. I parked in front of the place where he used to live, which is no longer there, on Music Row. Reverend Will Campbell, who you probably have heard of, Will lived in that same house when Chris was there. And Will used to tell me even the floors on the second floor were made out of dirt. I doubt that's true, but he said he was always afraid that Chris was going to come home late at night and fall through the floor. So anyway, that house, which I had seen when I first rambled around Music Row in '72, it was no longer there. It was a condo complex, one of the first condo complexes on Music Row, and then there was Bob Beckham's office. You may not know Bob Beckham, but Bob was essential in the music business back then. That was right there. Those two buildings together were gone. And then we went to, there was a place right kitty corner across what was then, at that point, it was Chet Atkins Avenue or Boulevard, whatever they call those streets. It used to be South Street. And it was at the corner of in that Music Square East, which used to be 16th Avenue South. And back, so it was right at that corner. Chris was confused by the change of the names of the streets, but there was a bar that was called the Tally Ho Tavern, which is on like Chris's Silver Tongue Devil album. But Chris used to work there as a bartender when he was still trying to make it, and he said he could make enough money. They gave him all the beer he could drink at $60 a week. He said they said they came out on the low end of that. Of course, Chris was a really young guy then. Yeah, and I don't need to go off into Chris stories here, but he became his showing me where the Tally Ho Tavern had been, which I knew because I'd been to the Tally Ho. But to go there with him, and there's a Curb Records building there now. It's not the main Curb building, but it's a Curb Records building. Nice, modern brick building. And so I couldn't resist it. Neither could he. I think we thought of it at the same time. We put our arms around each other and we sang. There's a song, The Silver Tongue Devil and I, which begins, I took myself down to, I'm not going to sing it. I took myself down to the Tally Ho Tavern to buy me a bottle of beer, etc. And he liked it, I liked it. I stumbled a little bit. I knew the lyrics, but I stumbled because I was singing next to Chris Christopherson in his song. But I enjoyed it. Anyway, Chris, that introduction to Music Row, and then conversations I had with him later, almost everything that was there that day in 2003 is now gone. It already begun, like the Curb building where the Tally Ho used to be. There was Audrey Williams and Merle Kilgore once owned a house on 16th, so like 2 doors down from where we were, from the Tally Ho on the other side of the street. There was a kind of a speakeasy for the musicians because Nashville was a dry city, and that house was still there then. It's not there now. And there were a lot of things he was telling me that weren't there, but telling me what had been there. And so as we drove back around, and he made fun of the naked statues there at the circle, he said, you know, Tim, I wish the old stuff was still here. And he was it was very melancholy. Of course, I did too, because that Music Row that he's talking about was the Music Row I used to wander around when I was 20 years old. So a lot of my knowledge of country music came from, my love of country music came from times talking to Chris and talking to Bear, and those are the people they're all in the book. Chris even liked it enough to write. I can't read it, I don't have my glasses. Tim is a wordsmith unlike any other. We've shared some good times together, and he encapsulates the experiences as if they were yesterday. A truly gifted writer and friend is what he said, which was very flattering to me that he would do that. Bobby Bear wrote the introduction, or the preface. Peter Cooper wrote the introduction. Anyway, so that covers the Chris and Bear stuff and how they introduced me to Nashville. And that's all in this book. And again, the changes in the city are well reflected in the book as we go along. I'm trying to think what else.
You might want to take some questions.
Okay, I'm long here. I will. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say, and then I'm going to take questions. I already blamed Bobby Bear for my love. I'm going to take questions, and I know you all are getting ready to want to leave here. But I'll read you this. I'll skip through it quickly. This is what I call the postlude on the book. The focus of this book is the people who made the music. From my telling of their stories, I'm telling the story of this city, or at least the musical part of it, illustrating the changes they and I have witnessed it. Even as I wrote this book, some of the featured friends died. Others have seen their health, physical and mental, battered by the maladies of age. George Harrison, the so-called Quiet Beatle, a half-century ago, saying all things must pass as a melancholy farewell to the Fab Four, and that song's sentiment which suit baby boomers like me, stunned by the band's breakup, is correct. All things do pass away. But just as we remember George and John and Paul and Ringo and honor their cultural impact, we need to remember the voices, guitars, and three chords and the truth beauty of Nashville's past. And we celebrate the Nashville skyline they peopled, not today's skyline, which might pass for Charlotte's or Atlanta's or Cincinnati's. Yes, I'm the guy traveling through this half century by tapping his precious memories. This isn't my story, it's their story, these people's stories, the city's story. I'm just a tour guide because I love these people, want to remind others of what they still mean to Nashville, what is gone. Chris ends, he ends the Pilgrim chapter 33 with this verse, or this is one of the verses rather. But if this world keeps right on turning for the better or the worse, and all he ever gets is older and around, from the rocking of the cradle to the rolling of the hearse, the going up was worth the coming down. And then he adds on the record, there's a lot of wrong directions on that lonely way back home. See, I'm just glad the direction led me to Nashville, where I made my life. I'm not planning on leaving. So I just wanted to add I skipped through it. That was the last chapter in the book. So if you have questions, I'm sorry if I've gone too long. I didn't even do my speech. So, does anybody have any questions about anything at all? Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Do I know Tommy Goldsmith?
Did you work with him at the Tennessee?
I did work with Tommy. Tommy, actually, when I was at the Banner, I got to know Tommy because back then the two papers were on the same floor, and we shared a hallway between us. So I knew Tommy back then. And in fact, I knew Tommy from even when I was working in Clarksville. I'd come down to parties for Tennessean people, usually because my best friend worked at the Tennessean. But yeah, I've known Tommy for 30 years. You know Tommy?
Oh, yeah.
Is he a friend of yours?
Yeah.
Okay, well, he's a great guy. He's a great guy, very skilled musician, and he's a good writer too. He never was my boss. I wish there was one point when they were changing features editors that I had endorsed him for the spot, but he didn't get it. They got somebody else, which I would love to have worked for Tommy Goldsmith, but we are friends. I don't see him. I don't see much of anybody anymore, but I do keep track of folks on Facebook and occasionally talk to my friends. Yes, sir, Tim.
Kind of a random question.
Sure.
Hattie Best owned and ran Tootsie's.
Right.
Now there's a Hattie B's hot chicken. Is there any connection between those?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't think so. I think Hattie B was probably just a made up name, or somebody who decided to start a chicken stand. I don't think so. You know, Hattie, of course, most people now wouldn't even know who she was. She died so long ago. I did a story. I did a story going to the graves of the stars, and I went to all the cemeteries and looked at their graves, and I found hers, and I liked Tootsie. She was an interesting woman. Yes, sir.
They announced the folks that are going to the Hall of Fame today, maybe it was yesterday. Who do you think should be in the Hall of Fame that isn't?
Who do I think should be in the Hall of Fame that isn't? That's, I think they sometimes put people in who aren't ready, but I don't know. Who did they announce today, do you know?
It was Toby Keith,
Toby,
John Anderson, and the guitar player for Elvis.
Scotty Moore?
No,
Oh, James Burton.
James Burton.
Nice man also. Scotty Moore was a friend of mine, that's why he's in this, there's a chapter on Scotty in here. Yeah, James I know pretty well too. He's a good fellow. Those are good selections. Of course, they all had impact on country music. They all had their eras are long gone now, but of course I think James. There's been health and death involved here. Of course, Toby just died. I can't think of anybody who actually should be in, but I will tell you there were people that I pushed to get in back before. Mac Wiseman, who helped found the Hall of Fame, helped found the Country Music Association. He wasn't in the Hall of Fame till 8 or 10 years ago, and he was always sad. He said he was glad he was finally in there, but it made him sad that he had to wait. Let's see. trying to think of others who got in. Carl Smith. You may not know Carl. Carl's in this book. There are a lot of pictures of these people from their families and stuff in this book too. But Carl was a great country musician, and he abandoned work to go home and stay home with his wife, Goldie Hill, and raise their kids and raise horses back around 1960. So he was pretty much ignored for a long time, but he was like a trailblazer for country music and country music on television. He had the first major TV show featuring country music. So he didn't get in again probably until about 10 years ago. And again, Carl was very deserving earlier. So they've been kind of slow getting folks in. I can't really think of those out there. Do you have some suggestions who should get in there?
What about the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band?
The they should be in there, and they should go in. That's right. They aren't in there. They should go in. They did so much for acoustic music, particularly. The full band, there's still a smaller version of it still going on. But when they did the Circle Beyond Broken albums, they opened up country music to an awful lot of people. And even like the old hippies like me bought those records because we listened to the bluegrass music. So yeah, they should be. I didn't realize that they were not. I don't have them memorized, but if they're not in there, they need to be. There are, like I said, there are people who just were not put in early enough. Harold Bradley, great session guitarist, the most guitar sessions of anybody ever. He didn't get in until late in his life. Things like that, they've been a little slow in reacting. I have great friends at the Hall of Fame, so, but oftentimes they're putting in too many of the younger people. Now Toby's dead now, but not a younger guy, but they're putting in too many of the younger people. Like Vince Gill got in a couple of years ago. I love Vince, and he deserves it to be in there, but he didn't deserve to get in there before some of the other people, the more senior musicians. I'm glad he's there. He's a nice fella, and he's a heck of a guitar player, and he's one of Nashville's great ambassadors. But again, they've gone there. Garth Brooks got in there. Garth, of course, should be there, but again, while he changed country music in the late 80s and early 90s, there were a lot of people who'd done a lot to country music. The Carl Smiths of the world who didn't, and Mac Wiseman, who had been the flat top guitar player for Flat and Scruggs. Those people, were passed over to get some of the star power in, and that helps, of course, draw people in. I understand the purpose for it. But yeah, that's my thought. And I'd like the Hall of Fame, their boss up there, the second in command, actually I gave him, Michael Gray, the first time he got a full-time job, he worked on my music staff at the Banner, so we've been friends for a long time. So I don't criticize the Hall of Fame, it's just the politics of who's put in, and the Country Music Association actually is in charge of who goes into the Hall of Fame. It's not really the Hall of Fame really isn't in charge of who goes in, it's the CMA. Any other questions?
Do you have any copies of your books today for sale?
I do. I have just a couple here, but I also, if there are more than a couple, I have some out in the car, and I'd be glad to get some. If you tell me you want one, they are $30, cash or check. I trust you if you do a check. I can't do plastic. I'm not smart enough to do plastic. So if anybody wants one, I've got two here. This is my demo one. I take it to all my speeches. I've got two fresh ones here, and if you need more, I'll just go out to the car. Just tell me who wants one. So thank you very much.